Now let's move on to the cycle of abuse. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the cycle of abuse, but it does play into this. So let's review it real quickly. If you're familiar with the 4 phases and the cycle of abuse circle that's been common and has been out there for years and years and years, the cycle of abuse includes 4 stages. The tension building stage, where the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim is tense, and the perpetrator begins to show signs of anger and frustration. The abuse survivor is hyper-focused, trying to find signs or an idea of when the abuse might start again. And the survivor might try to find different ways to avoid or appease the perpetrator in the hopes that the abuse won't occur again. And then in the incidents of abuse, obviously the actual abuse does occur. There's abusive behaviors. The idea is to control the victim. It might include, threats, stalking, humiliation, acts of violence, financial, spiritual abuse, all the things that are shown here in the power and control wheel. It either could be a single incident or a series of incidents. And then the reconciliation phase, which is when the honeymoon phase, as it's also known as, starts to take hold, and the perpetrator starts to reestablish a connection with the person who's been victimized. They might do nice things, agree to get help, go to therapy, buy gifts, cook dinner, spend money on the victim, something along those lines. And obviously the idea is to keep the victim from leaving, so they can continue to involve or continue to abuse them as they move along and have control and power. This is the time when most of the gaslighting might start occurring. And then finally, the calm phase, the relationship between the abuser and the victim is relatively peaceful. This particular period of time also does have tension, but it starts to build again slowly over time, and then it continues over and over and over. But this whole power and control cycle sort of cements the trauma bonding that occurs with the victim. And so that leads us into trauma bonds. So trauma bonds are the emotional attachments between the victim and their abuser that occur in the relationships that we're talking about today. And these bonds are typically marked by the complexities of abuse and control and dependency and deep feelings of love and admiration and gratitude in the victim for the abuser. So you can kind of see in this particular example of the cycle of the trauma bond, abusive behaviors, loving, apologetic, and attentive behaviors, and increased feelings of attachment, and then increased power and balance. So that sort of hooks the individual who's being trauma bonded in. So there are a couple of characteristics that follow along with creating the trauma bond. Obviously, as the last slide talked about, there's the power differentials that need to exist between the abuser and the victim. So, I was talking earlier, as I mentioned to you all in a podcast episode, and the topic was, how does someone who's been in a narcissistic relationship develop their own self-trust again? How do they learn how to trust themselves again? And one of the things that I was talking about was the fact that when you're in a reasonably healthy relationship, you are a reasonably healthy person individually, meaning that there isn't a power differential going into a new relationship with someone. You feel secure, you feel like you can trust yourself, you feel like you have a good idea about what your boundaries are and your values and all of those kinds of things. And in a scenario where there's an ability for a trauma bond to occur, that has not happened. The individual who is the quote victim, the survivor, is struggling with self, struggling with vulnerabilities, struggling with a multitude of things that create a power differential for the scenario or the relationship. Another characteristic is intermittent abusive and non-abusive treatment during the relationship. So what this means is the person who is the perpetrator is not constantly berating, is not constantly being horrible. In fact, some of the time they're actually nice, or they are sweet, or they're apologetic, or they're agreeable, or whatever it is. And this creates this intermittent reinforcement that is the strongest type of reinforcement that there is. This is what keeps individuals in the relationship, because their brains are releasing these endorphins every time the abuser does something that's actually somewhat nice. And it creates this idea in the head of the victim, oh, well, maybe if I just hold out, this will happen again. It's very similar to what happens with addiction. You know, when the individuals who are, let me put it this way. I have never worked with anybody who has an addiction issue that said that drugs and alcohol were good for them. But yet, if you put it in front of them, they will most likely use. Why? They logically know, but because they see the drug, because if they use the drug a little bit or alcohol or whatever it is, it releases an initial endorphin. It kind of tricks your brain into thinking, oh, this might actually work. Maybe I can manage it. Maybe this person isn't going to be like this. Maybe I can drink 3 glasses of wine and not get in trouble. Whatever it is, it's very similar to that. And so that is something that is what keeps these relationships bonded together. And then the survivor experiences intense fear and a strong will to survive. And in many cases, the abuser relays stories of childhood, which causes their abusive behavior, which then makes the victim feel sorry for them, and understandably that they have to behave this way. But guess what? I can stay around and I can help. I can make sure that this person isn't in fear anymore. I'm not going anywhere. Now, this is not conscious. This is just the pull of the empath or the codependent person, which we'll talk about, to want to, quote, take care of this person who is injured or is perceived to be struggling or suffering or in a lot of pain. And I want to stay around with that person because I think I may be able to make some kind of changes. So there was a question that came up while I was talking about this slide. What is the name of the podcast that I mentioned? It's Unfiltered is the name of the podcast. I'm going to type it in here because it's spelled differently. And you can refer it to your clients or listen to yourself, but they interview all different clinicians about different kinds of things related to narcissistic abuse. It's really good. And they have a lot of great resources on the website. Then we have another question here. Can the gaslighter become avoidant when they realize the gaslighting is not working? Well, yes, but that's not necessarily because they realize the gaslighting is not working. In general, individuals who are manipulative and abusive are avoidant. They're not problem solvers. They don't want to get involved with anything emotional because, 1, they don't know how to deal with it. 2, they haven't been exposed to it. They're not even aware it exists. And they don't have coping skills. They don't have problem solving skills. So yes, they can become avoidant. It's usually not because they realize gaslighting is not working. It's more an issue of I've used all these tactics, even though they don't look at it like that, and this person isn't coming under my control, so I don't want anything to do with them. Okay, so they push them away. They push the person away. Usually that's through harmful behavior or discarding, as we'll talk about when we talk about the pattern of narcissistic and abusive relationships. But the thing that I impress on my clients when I'm working with them and other clinicians when I'm talking about it is try not to overthink that a narcissistic person or a person who's emotionally manipulative is multifaceted, because they are not. They're very simplistic. We're not talking about someone who is aware of all of the stuff that's going on with them. In fact, They have no insight into themselves at all. They're simply functioning from a place of trying to avoid sinking into their own abyss, for lack of a better analogy. These are not individuals that have all kinds of proper tools to function in society. They do not have the characteristics and the traits that they need to be able to adjust their personality appropriately. Therefore, they're acting from a fairly primitive state of, I need to get something to fill up my hole that never gets filled up. And so we tend to overthink, I think, individuals who are manipulative as like sort of evil geniuses. They're not. It's very simplistic. It's very primitive, no insight at all. In fact, they're not even thinking about their victims at all, except from the standpoint of what I can get from them. They really don't spend much time at all thinking about you, me, or anybody else, other than what we could potentially give them. But nothing else.